Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So this is just to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded. So if you need to leave at any point, don't worry, we'll be uploading the recording to YouTube. And if there's anyone else that wants to, and if you want to pass it on to any friends or comrades beyond, then please do. It'll be up on the Abolitionist Futures YouTube, hopefully within a few days. So these webinars were created as a space to gather in response to the momentum rising to oppose the Draconian Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill 2021. We joined the call and leadership from Sisters Uncut to #KillTheBill. Priti Patel's policing bill would severely restrict the right to protest, drastically removing the ability of the people to make their voices heard. Following the horrific murder of Sarah Everard and the subsequent police violence against women at a vigil in her memory, protesters have taken to the streets demanding accountability and transformation. Across mainstream political parties, many of the arguments we hear being put forward as solutions to the problem of gendered violence are those that rely on carceral logics, which we seek to question, resist, and dismantle. These remedies, such as undercover officers in clubs and pubs, are making misogyny a hate crime, miss the mark for the future we want to see and build. Recognizing the urgency of this moment, we come together online to share knowledge, build our movements of resistance, and take collective action. We offer these online events in addition to the incredible shows of strength and resistance we have seen on the streets in recent days. So we're recording these and they'll be available on our YouTube channel. So there's an event on today, tomorrow, and on Friday. But if there are any demonstrations or actions in your town or city, please prioritize those. We know that there are many of us in opposition to the bill who, for whatever reason, cannot be at those demonstrations, but still seek a space to come together. So I'm going to briefly touch on the right to protest before handing over to our speakers, who will carry forward the main of the conversation. Okay, Priti Patel's policing bill has many measures beyond the restrictions to protest. It introduces a prevent-style approach to youth violence, which will wreak devastation amongst racialized communities, increase surveillance, capturing and loosening the criteria to collect personal information and carry out stop and search. This will continue to see more and more of our information gathered by the Metropolitan Police and shared across government departments, which leads to, when we see things like the gangs matrix and the Windrush scandal, data and information gathered like this can only be used to further inflict harm on us by the state. Weeks after stoking the culture war for a free speech crisis, alongside restricting protests which cause unease, a Tory MP remarked yesterday he shouldn't have to look at protests from his window in Westminster. This bill would have everyone critical of government well within its scopes, with specific measures around locations such as Parliament Square or targeting of newspapers that we know all too often print the friendly profiles for our leaders. There's much to be angry about in this bill, but the right to protest expands to them all, because without expressing our displeasure in any one element, because without our right to protest, expressing our displeasure at any one element becomes impossible. And that is purposeful. Why would a government under whose premiership we have seen the largest mass death in peacetime, the onset of economic catastrophe, want to give us the opportunity to reckon with them? Better to start locking us up when we're younger and for longer, exactly what this bill intends to do. Why would a government who have lined their pals' pockets want us to express our anger? Free speech, free assembly, and free association were long fought for by the left, and principles we defend as a means to hold power to account. As such, they are indivisible from related freedoms, such as the freedom to organize for the betterment of society's material conditions. When we defend these rights, we do not merely do so in the name of abstract principles, but as a means to advance popular democracy, to empower workers and each other, and to challenge state power. So it's with that vision of challenging state power that we move forward. And on that note, I want to introduce our three speakers. So the first speaker that I'll be talking is Emmanuelle Andrews, who is a policy and campaigns officer at the human rights and civil liberties organization Liberty. She works on policing, protest, and state surveillance, currently campaigning against the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. She also works across the arts, academia, and activism, including as a researcher in residence at the South London Gallery, where she is working with youth on a colonial archive project, and as a founding member of the Free Black University, an anti-colonial, queer, and Black feminist project committed to the development of radical, imaginative, and transformative knowledge production. Zehrah Hasan is a barrister at Garden Court Chambers and a director of Black Protest Legal Support. She specializes in migrants' rights, racial justice, state accountability, protest rights, trans and queer liberation, and gender equality. She is also the external coordinator for the trade union Legal Sector Workers United. And our final speaker will be Asad. Asad Rehman is the executive director of War on Want, a lifelong campaigner against racial injustice and economic injustice. Asad was the previous chair of the Newman Monitoring Project and has been involved in multiple campaigns of holding the state to account through campaigns such as the Justice for John Charles de Menendez and campaigns such as the previous campaigns against the policing bills in 1984 and 94. Asad has been at the forefront of the climate justice movement, both in the UK and globally, helping to reframe climate as an issue of racialized capitalism, economic and social injustice. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, and that is Emmanuelle Andrews.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much. Thank you to the organisers for having me here today, and to everybody in the audience for showing up. I think it's such an exceptional example of mass solidarity that we've seen over the past week or so. And, you know, I mean, this has been going on for much longer than that. And I know that many people are showing up from previous movements. And I just want to thank everyone for spending their time here listening to us talk about this really egregious bill. The bill, as you know, as has already been mentioned, introduces a wave of draconian new powers, and that, you know, the full details of which were only released last week. And it was debated on yesterday and the day before, and then voted upon yesterday. So it's literally had it's only been in Parliament for a week, which is extraordinary. 6 days obviously is not enough time at all for parliamentarians or civil society or, you know, members of the public to actually give a forensic analysis of this legislation, and which is, you know, this is a strategy, of course, because there's so much in there, and the kind of whole point is that nestled within, you know, bits that we might want to support, there are some really egregious measures. I'm going to touch on some of the specific protest aspects of this bill, but I wanted to first start by just giving a kind of broad brush overview of what else is in this bill, because it affects a wide range of communities that really also need our support and need our mobilization. So to start with, I just wanted to mention the impact that this bill has on Gypsy and traveller communities, who are, as I'm sure many of us know, are amongst the most persecuted and marginalised communities in the UK. The bill would give the police the power to seize people's vehicles, which obviously for Gypsy and traveller communities is their home. And, you know, like much that is already in this bill, it just deflects from you know, what the real issue is here, and that's that the authorities have failed to provide sufficient sites for Gypsy and traveller communities to live safely in a way that reflects their nomadic way of life. And as you know, for those of us that were watching the debate the last 2 days, we saw how the government were really relying on the fact that this is what their constituents want. You know, this has been in their this was in the Conservative manifesto, and this has been something that they've been trying to push forward for a while now. But you know, that's simply not true. That this is that the public support these measures. Friends, families, and travellers and Liberty members responded to the government's consultation that they did. I think it was last year, and the overwhelming response from people was that people don't agree, and even the police don't agree on giving the police more powers. Then the second area that I wanted to briefly touch on was the serious violence measures that, you know, has also already been mentioned. These are supposedly supposed to protect people from harm, to save lives, to prevent injury, but, you know, in a very similar manner to the prevent duty, it replicates many of the harms that it is supposedly trying to reduce, as well as being an incredibly discriminatory and unjust proposal. The serious violence reduction order is a part of the bill that is essentially a new stop and search power that would give the police the ability to stop and search someone at any place, completely free of suspicion. You know, as many of us know, we already understand the impact that Stop and Search has on communities, especially Black and brown communities. But I know that other speakers will probably touch on that shortly. But yeah, we're here to talk about protest, and I'm so glad that we are, because as we've seen over the past week, the government and the police have been handling protests extraordinarily. And I think it's just worth mentioning how the government wants to pit us against each other and essentially divide us into good and bad protesters. So I think I just want to caution us as well when we think about using the terms like peaceful protest, or trying to define the protests that happened over the weekend, for example, as vigils, or relying on that terminology of peacefulness, or women with flowers, for example, because I think, you know, the legislation, the bill that is coming through Parliament at the moment is basically trying to move that line from what counts as peaceful. So I think we really have to be aware of relying on those definitions, because that's exactly what the government is trying to change. And I think just the bill as a whole is just, and particularly the protest sections, are just another way to attempt to criminalize our right to dissent, our right to challenge, our right to refuse. And I think we have to remember that protest isn't a gift that the state can give us or take away at its pleasing. It's a vital tool. It's a human right, and it's one of the main ways that we can stand up to the state and make our voices heard. Now, I just want to now go on to the kind of nitty gritty of the bill, and I'm really aware of time, so yeah, please do wave at me if I'm going over. But it's really important to note that the police already have incredible powers to manage protest. I know that the justification for this bill essentially is, or the protest parts of this bill is essentially that the police don't feel they have many powers, and they're specifically looking to, you know, Extinction Rebellion over the past year or so, and Black Lives Matter. But actually, in actual fact, they do have significant powers to regulate protest, and the majority of that is nestled within the Public Order Act. And I think it's really interesting that currently the Public Order Act distinguishes between moving, like marches basically, so moving protests, and static assemblies, so protests that don't move, still protests, much like the vigil, for example, would have counted under that. And the bill essentially amends the Public Order Act to bring those two different types of protests into parity with one another, which is something that we've been aware might be kind of coming on the cards for a few months, and it's something we've been campaigning against. And the reason being because that the powers that they have already to police marches are already really broad, and now bringing static assemblies into that is really worrying. And previously with static assemblies, there were only 3 conditions whereby a police officer could, the conditions that the police could set, and that was the place, the maximum duration, and the maximum number of people. But now they can do anything as appeared to them necessary, which basically gives them unlimited conditions. That means that they can ban a static protest and a march. And I think it's just, yeah, it's you'll see as I go through this, there are just throughout the bill and throughout the protest sections, there's just a broadening of language and a broadening of ways in which the police can impose these conditions. As I'm sure has been noted by many, the new section on noise is deeply concerning. It essentially means that anybody, any noise, any protest that makes noise that may result in serious disruption could be captured by this legislation. And what we see here is also that essentially protest is being deprioritized in the face of businesses, for example, so businesses in the locality, which is deeply worrying, because protest is a fundamental right. It shouldn't be about whether people are disrupted, basically. And again, I mean, as I'm sure we'll talk. Oh, I've got my 2 minutes. Okay, wow. I mean, this is a really good example of how big this bill is, because I've literally touched on 2 elements of it so far. I'll really briefly talk about the public nuisance aspects of the bill. So I think this bit, you know, if it wasn't so awful, it would be really hilarious, to be honest, because the public nuisance section that was previously a common law offence, which is now going to be a statutory offence, mean you can land yourself in prison for 10 years simply for causing I can't remember the language, for causing serious annoyance, which obviously is the point of protest. Protest is supposed to be annoying. Protest is supposed to have an impact, and now the police will be able to charge you on that basis. And it's really unclear whether protest would even be a defence to that offence. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to take up time of the other speakers, but to conclude really quickly, as you can see from this really kind of broad brush summary of what is happening in this bill, it's a really direct attack on our right to protest. And it comes at a time when, you know, the pandemic has allowed the government to gain enormous power to interfere with our lives, and repeatedly sideline Parliament, which is exactly what we're seeing happen again. And I think we've seen over this week how amazing all of the momentum has been around this bill, and I just want to really encourage people to continue it. We've had over 12,000 signatures to our petition, and in combination with another set of groups who are also running the same petition, the numbers are at over 200,000. And I just think, you know, I'm just so pleased that people are standing up to this attack. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emmanuelle, and for all the work that you and your colleagues at Liberty and all across are doing on lobbying on this bill. If I could ask, actually, if there are any links that people can find out more information in regards to the guides that have been written to explain some of the other parts of the bill that perhaps aren't spoken about within the public realm as much. Emmanuelle will drop them into the chat box so everyone will be able to access them. But without further ado, we'll move on to Zehrah.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me here today and for mobilizing this so quickly. So I'm going to talk more specifically about how the bill has a very blatant racialized impact. But I will first start by echoing what the other speakers have already said about the fact that this bill is a major assault on the right to protest, and a very blatant and significant move to furnish authoritarian power. And in my view, the catalyst for this has been, in some ways, the fact that protest movements over the past year have been so effective and powerful in drawing attention to state violence, and in challenging state institutions. And that's vitally, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement's spotlight on police brutality. But the issue is obviously that this bill seeks to devastate the right to protest, and in ways that will inevitably disproportionately harm racialized and marginalized protesters. And in a lot of ways, it will allow the police to continue and expand the ways they restrict demonstrations after the COVID regulations fall away. And we know that these regulations have been relied on heavily over the past year to effectively ban protests. And obviously the way that they've applied in terms of fixed penalty notices have also disproportionately impacted racialized communities as well. And essentially what this bill and the COVID regulations have done is they've emboldened the police. We know that over the last few days, the protests that have been taking place, led very powerfully by Sisters Uncut, have been subject to very, very heavy policing. And this has been to the extent that Black activists from Black Music Movement and BLM Leeds have released a statement saying that the level of police harassment they've received over the past week has meant that they've now stopped attending some of these protests over the last couple of days. Black Protest Legal Support, which is the organisation that I'm part of, has also seen an egregious affront to the position of legal observers. Essentially, Black Protest Legal Support provides legal observers to protests that have, that are Black-led, that are anti-racist, or that concern issues affecting Black, brown and racialized groups. And legal observers attend these protests independent of the protest to monitor police behavior. We've got a hub of Legal Observer volunteers, and those who have been attending the protests over the past few days have been consistently harassed by the police. Legal observers should be exempt under the COVID regulations because they are voluntary workers, and as I've said, they're independent from the protest. But last night, particularly troublingly, 4 of our legal observers were arrested. 3 of them were given fixed penalty notices and 1 of them was released under investigation. And out of those 4, 3 of them were people of colour. Essentially, they were arrested when the crowd, a few protesters were arrested from the crowd. The crowd had moved on, and the 4 legal observers who stayed behind to make a note of those 3 arrests were then turned on by the police and arrested themselves. And there are around 20 officers surrounding each legal observer. 2 were taken to custody and released in the early hours of the morning. And I say this because an attack on legal observers is an attack on our ability through community movements to hold the police to account. Legal observers are there to monitor police behaviour and provide legal support to people assaulted, arrested and violated by the police. And the police directly stopped attempts last night of our legal observers to monitor the police's conduct when they were conducting arrests of protesters. And so it's wrong to ban protests. It's wrong that the level of impunity police have at the moment. And it's egregious to also stop that from being monitored and held to account on the streets. But in my view, the police felt emboldened to do that through the COVID regulations and through the fact that this bill is happening. So this bill forms a part of a wider pervasive effort by this government to suppress protest as a vital form of resistance. And it comes following the HMC FRS report, which was ordered by the Home Secretary in light of the Black Lives Matter and XR movements. And part of that report looks at things like developing covert intelligence, gathering methods, the increased use of facial recognition technology at protests, which we know is discriminatory by design. And also Black Protest Legal Support has noted the presence of potential facial recognition vans at almost every protest over the last few days. The report also supports expanding stop and search, and which of course we know disproportionately harms Black comrades who are already 40 times more likely to be searched under suspicionless stop and search powers. And it also labels people as aggravated activists, so those who commit protest-related crime or unlawful behaviour. So in terms of this legislation, as Emmanuelle set out, the police already have considerable power to impose conditions and restrict protests. But what this bill essentially seeks to do is lower the legal test required for the police to use those powers. So essentially, there are 3 main kind of concerns, sort of overall concerns we have about the bill. The first is how broad the language of the legislation is and how this leaves wide scope for interpretation by institutionally racist police and courts. The second is how much power it affords to the police to restrict protests and to police them, and the impact that would obviously have on racialized groups. And thirdly, again, how harsh carceral punishments are meted out for proposed offences within the bill. And of course, the entire point of protest is to cause impact, to disrupt and to dissent. And so by trying to curtail every aspect of civil disobedience and criminalise these very kind of age-old direct action and protest tactics, the bill does essentially erode our right to protest, and it puts police impunity on the ground on a legislative footing. So essentially, in terms of the impact on marginalised and racialised communities, firstly, in terms of police brutality, we know the police have always treated Black, brown and racialised protesters with particular contempt and violence. From the Mangrove protest in 1970 to the Black People's Day of Action in 1981, we hear kind of 2 key stories, one of institutional racism in wider policing and one of institutional racism in the policing of protests. And in our view, nothing's changed. Black Protest Legal Support saw the police deploy riot gear. They routinely relied on physical and verbal intimidation, and they charged horses at people at the Black Lives Matter protests last summer. They also kettled hundreds of protesters, including many young people, until the early hours of the morning, and relied on Section 50 powers to ask them to provide their personal details before allowing release, which in our view is potentially unlawful. We have also seen the police use batons against the Tamil community in Harrow just on Sunday at a protest outside the home of a British Tamil woman who had been on hunger strike. So whilst what happened to protesters at Saturday's vigil for Sarah Everard on Clapham Common was horrific, and we stand in solidarity with those assaulted, arrested and violated by the police, we cannot forget that our Black brothers, sisters and siblings, non-Black racialised people and trans people are subject to this level of state violence all the time on the streets, in police stations and in prisons. We know that the police are 5 times more likely to use force against Black people, and nearly 1 in 3 incidents involving the use of force is against Black, brown and racialised people. And they will obviously use this force more, intimidate more and act violently against protesters when they feel emboldened to do so by the law. Also, by having more scope for interpretation in the bill, we can be fairly certain it will come with more police brutality and impunity, leaving Black, brown and racialised people at the sharp end of it. And briefly, the other thing is that obviously we know that the weighty penalties will most impact those already heavily criminalised by the state and who disproportionately face legal repercussions. We know that Black, brown and racialised people are subject to disproportionate charging and sentencing within the criminal punishment system. And we know that police powers will always harm our communities the most. So in essence, Black protest legal support is very clear. Policing is institutionally violent and racist. And so if this bill becomes law, it will perpetuate the very oppression that Black Lives Matter and this weekend's protests have sought to challenge. So we stand very firmly against the bill, the chilling effect it will have on the right to protest more broadly, and the attempted silencing of Black voices. And obviously, you know, huge kudos to Sisters Uncut and BLM activists for all the incredible work they're doing to lead the fight. And obviously we're going to continue sending legal observers to protests and making sure there is someone on the ground holding the police to account.
Thank you so much, Zehrah. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here where we send our full solidarity to you and your colleagues for all the incredible work you're doing and the harassment you're facing at the hands of the police as well. But I think all of us have seen over the last year the crucial and importance of monitoring the police and holding them to account, not only with the lockdown fines and that we've seen imposed on people arbitrarily, but also the horrific scenes that we've seen at protests over last summer and over the weekend. So thank you to you and your colleagues for that, and full support to you all. And we'll now move on to our final speaker. So that is Asad Rehman.
Hi, thank you, Ilyas, and thank you to Emmanuelle and Zehrah. I think they so comprehensively covered all of those issues. So I thought maybe I would say a little bit also about maybe the global context, because I think we have to also situate what's happening here within that broader context. So we all know we've seen this rise of authoritarianism and extreme right-wing forces, this rolling back of human rights, this sort of normalizing of repressive laws. And of course, all of that was happening pre-COVID, right? As the crisis of neoliberal inequality, racial injustice, climate, compounding all of the inequalities and injustices. And that was already challenging this orthodoxy of what we call liberal democracy, and created this rise of far-right populist forces. And what's really fascinating is when you look at all of these forces, wherever they are, there are some very, very common sort of themes that run through them. You know, that they locate themselves very much in this frame of like law and order, of being pro-police, of course, of using race and targeting minorities, whether that's Roma, Black, Muslim, etc. And of course, wrapping themselves very much in this flags and statues, this idea of the state and of the nation state. And I mean, it's fascinating to see it, of course, being reproduced in such visceral ways within this bill. And there's no hiding that. But it's also important to, I think, for us to recognize how social democratic forces have responded to these far-right populist forces, because what they've largely done, of course, is co-opted the narrative of the far right and often say we have to speak to this unspoken or this silent majority because it's their views. And when you are listening to many of the MPs speak in that debate, I mean, it's just shocking. You could have heard those being, you know, Front National or National Front or whatever kind of framing that was being used, and now was being so normalized within the parameters there. And so it's not just that Sri Lanka or India or Brazil, Israel or US under Trump, the countries that have traditionally been seen as being the rise of the far right, or the Polands or Hungaries. It's also France and Netherlands, where it's social democratic forces overtly not saying we're of the far right that have been using and have been imposing these repressive laws. And of course, what they've done is really fascinating, because they're normalizing something that's so extreme, but then in the way that it's the discourse around it, it becomes that this is the most normal response. And it's just fascinating how that discourse changes and how they normalize this discourse. And of course, armed, of course, by the support of the media. Now, we haven't got time to talk about the securitization agenda, surveillance, for all of the other things that have been brought into place in this repressive architecture that's being built all around the world. But I think, so what we've seen this is, I think, a process of what some people say, you know, this authoritarianism that comes from the top, but authoritarianism that's also coming from below as well, and creating this really dynamic that we're facing. And of course, during COVID, we've seen many of these authoritarian and repressive measures being rolled out. We as War on Want work with movements and workers' organizations all around the world. And, you know, you look at Bangladesh, you look at the arbitrary arrest of trade union activists because they're seen as being threatening the economic interest, and the economic interest is the national interest. So arbitrarily arresting people because in this moment you want to be maintained. You see in Sri Lanka, where garment workers refusing to go into unsafe working conditions, it's the military that comes and then forces workers back into those. This idea between the corporations and the military coming together again under the argument of security. We've seen it, of course, very viscerally now with the Indian farmers' protests, and how Modi has used repressive legislation to try and crush the largest social movement protests that India has seen. And it's not just in those countries. In South Africa, one of our partners, Abishali, which is the shack dwellers movement, you know, some of the most vulnerable movements and communities that have been under the most repressive restrictions. What we've seen is also the state outsourcing some of this repression to private security firms, to contractors, and they're acting in the name of the state. I'm seeing, you know, everything from arbitrary detention to attacks on activists. And of course, the reality is, the world we live in, this is going to get worse. Inequality is not getting any better. The climate crisis is not going to get better. All of these things are going to compound. So what we're doing in this moment isn't a momentary fight. I think actually it's a fight that we have to see that goes back to the past, but also goes to the front, to the future. So I want to just quickly say some reflections on the past as well. So you can see from my white hair and my beards, maybe I've been around a little while. When I saw Sarah's vigil and the attack on that, you know what the immediate image that came into my mind was of, you know, Gurdeep Singh Jagger in Southall, you know, after he was the racist murder that took place down, when the community came out to protest, how the police broke that protest. When people said, oh, it's terrible, they're a vigil of somebody who's been murdered. And I just broke, well, you know, countless vigils we've had where people have died in custody. Ibrahim Assay, you know, have all been broken up by the police, right? When Akhtar Ali Beg was murdered, the arm of the state broke all of those things. And what happened straight after this, what I would call repression on the street, of course, is this a series of legislation. So you can look back at 1984 and you look at the first, and it's also fascinating, of course, you look at the banners, kill the bill, reclaim the streets, you say, those were all the slogans, of course, of yesteryear, right? And it's great that they are being repurposed and brought, but there's a history to them as well, and some lessons that are really important for us to learn. And I know on Friday you're going to be talking about the movement building, so I'm not necessarily going to go in there. But you know, when we talk about that 1984 police bill, which was the Kill the Bill campaign, you know, which was led by Black organizations, because it was the Black-led organizations that had seen what happened in 1981 with the uprising, seen what happened in 1984 with the uprisings, that led and tried to build that coalition, saying not just of Black organizations, but the trade union movement, with civil liberties organizations, and much broader. And when it came to 1986 and the Public Order Act, you know, which was of course expressly brought in after the miners' strike, right, to limit the right of protest, we see something remarkably similar to what's happening now, right? Within all of this repressive legislation, they also say, well, we'll give you a SOP. We will bring in laws on incitement to racial and religious hatred. And already what you start to see is this attempt to break then the movement between parts who say, well, the bill in all isn't that bad. We should just disagree with this bit or that bit, rather than actually start to argue what the logic behind the bill is in its first place. And I think there's important lessons where people fell for that. And there were large parts of our community that said, we can't oppose this bill because look, it's going to put incitement in religious and racial hatred. And our argument then as the monitoring groups and as Black groups was, this has never been about the police don't have enough power. The question has always been about police accountability and how the police use those powers. And the argument now of saying, you know, that the response to misogyny and patriarchal violence is we need more power. No, it's the question is why haven't the police acted? Why don't they act on behalf of our communities, which is a much bigger and deeper question. Look, there are also wider lessons for us. You know, when I was thinking about 1994, you know, when the criminal justice bill, and thinking about how ridiculous this question about noise on a protest issue was. 3 minutes, I'm going to, you know, in 1994, you know, the same argument was used about repetitive beats to try and end the Free Party movement, right? The same attacks on the traveller and gypsy community were brought in. You know, that's when councils ended. The duty ended on councils to provide sites to traveller and gypsy communities, which is why, you know, we've got travellers and gypsy communities being increasingly marginalised. What happened at that moment, I think, was really fascinating, was that the movement we built went out and beyond our circles and connected with, for example, the ravers in terms of the Free Party scene, of course, the environmentalists and the road protesters. And it went out and it tried very, very seriously to try and build the connection to make a much bigger argument about what that bill was doing. Now, we ultimately lost, right? But I think we won as well, because we have to remember that what happened within that movement, in the fight itself, it politicized a generation of people. And it was that generation of people who then a few years later created that upsurge in the 2000s of these incredible new movements that were created. And many of them were politicized through this space. So I think there's a challenge for us now, both in how we respond to this, to think beyond our own close circles of the groups who are already in, and how do we turn the public against this? And I'm going to end now, but you know, there's a lesson, I think, from the poll tax, right, where again you have an authoritarian government in a moment passes a deeply repressive draconian piece of legislation. It goes through Parliament, but that wasn't the end. Just getting them from the bill to the law wasn't the end. What it meant, what it led to, of course, was huge grassroots campaigning, massive mobilizations. 250,000 people marched against the poll tax. It became impossible for the poll tax actually to be implemented, so much so that the police said we have to stop arresting people for not paying for not paying the community charge, because otherwise the number of people that are going to have to be arrested is beyond our capability and capacity. Ultimately, it led to, of course, the defeat of Thatcher within the Conservative Party and a departure. But there are important lessons for us not to also make this campaign simply about killing the bill, because I think we have to recognize that this bill will be rammed through, right? Because like in 1994 with the poll tax, with the Criminal Justice Act bill in 1994, ultimately ultimately the Labour Party, then led the Shadow Home Secretary was a certain Tony Blair, abstained on the final reading of the bill, right? So we also know that, you know, there's a question for us in terms of thinking only within Westminster, that the strategy is only in Westminster. The strategy, of course, has to be in Westminster. We have to try and hold the line of MPs and as many as possible. But the real change will come the movements we build outside. That's where the real dynamic will come. And that's where our future and our hope of overturning this bill and making it ungovernable has to happen. This attack on the right to dissent, the right to protest, is a global attack that's taking place. Of course, it's being targeted primarily, first and foremost, at what they see as being the bad protesters. And I totally agree with Emmanuelle. This discourse about between good protesters and bad protesters is one that we have to hold the line and say, actually, what we're defending is the right to protest, full stop, not allow this. Because in 1994, you'll laugh that this whole argument was characterized as, are you a fluffy or are you a spiky? I.e., do you believe in direct action or do you believe in peaceful protest? And it seriously hampered the movement because it drew the energy of the movement into an argument between itself when we should have been actually being united against the laws of the state. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Asad. I think I saw someone write in the chat that learning about that arc of history is so important and motivating, and I absolutely agree. And just crucially, picking up on that point there of when you said, like, they always give us something. They drop something in there and they give something in order to try and quash the movement. And we've seen that in the last few days, and Labour's bigger, like, with many of the suspect solutions they're putting forward, the one that's raising a lot of eyebrows is this idea of making misogyny a hate crime, because we know hate crime legislation is not fit for purpose. It interpersonalizes institutional issues. There's no way forward. There's no path forward in terms of justice through that framework as it stands anyway. So actually, for people that are interested, the next session of Kill the Bill tomorrow of this webinar series is specifically about why hate crime won't save us. So please do attend that session as well. So we've had a lot of questions come through. So we will take them one at a time. So I think if I press this button, it turns up on your screens. So the first question that's come in is it even possible at this point to actually stop Parliament allowing this? How can we help outside of signing petitions if we can't attend protests? I'm just going to attach this to one or two other questions that have come in that are very similar, which is what's the main action we can take now after the second reading? What next? What now? What do we do? So essentially, sort of, what's the path forward in with this particular bill as it comes now? So Emmanuelle, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, and those are really excellent questions. In terms of what's happening next, so the bill is going to now be going through committee stage, which essentially means that amendments can start coming through. I think, you know, I just want to also echo what Asad said in terms of not being beholden to the parliamentary process. Of course, we want to, whilst we can, knock some of the kind of rougher edges off this bill, but as we've seen, you know, with the parliamentary arithmetic, it's very unlikely that we'll be able to get what we want, essentially. But I don't think that's a reason for us to give up hope. I think one of the really challenging parts of this bill is that, and also amazing things in the sense of the mass mobilization that's come out of the end of it, is that the protest things are so horrendous that people are really, you know, they're speaking up about it. But I do worry as well that, you know, should we have some protest amendments successfully go through, government will also take that as a kind of, okay, we can still sneak through all the other horrendous stuff. And I think that's where we really need to, as Asad said so beautifully, that's when we really need to be in solidarity with all the other different community groups that are affected by this bill and still come out and make our voices heard against those aspects. Because I think, you know, whilst across the party there is some leeway potentially with the protest stuff, you know, with the Gypsy Roma traveller aspects, it's looking really unlikely. So I think, you know, talking to our MPs, especially when it comes to those that are on the committee, and thinking about how we can support some of the amazing amendments that are going to come through from different organisations, but also being aware that, you know, we don't It doesn't start and end with protest only. There are other groups that are affected by the other parts of the bill, and that's where we also really need to make our voices heard.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. Zehrah, Asad, do either of you want to come in?
Zehrah first.
Yeah, I think, no, I totally echo what Emmanuelle said. I think it's very much, this is the kind of thing where we need to have an approach on every single level, and some levels will be more effective than others. But I think, you know, the parliamentary approach, obviously, you know, there's a lot of work being done around that already. There needs to be some thinking around legal approaches to the bill. So if it does become legislation, the way that it is utilized, or just the fact of it in itself, like how we challenge that from a legal perspective, particularly taking into account Articles 10 and 11 of the Human Rights Act, in terms of, you know, the right to protest. And obviously just showing up on the streets and through kind of community movements and campaigns. I think that is probably one of the most effective ways that we can challenge this bill and challenge what it stands for, because just by showing up on the streets, whether kind of before it's legislated for or after, we are directly resisting what it's trying to do. So I think that's really crucial. And, you know, there are so many, you know, ways that that is being made more accessible in light of the pandemic, and thinking about ways that we can move kind of protest online as well. But I think for those who can and are able to, showing up on the streets and sort of saying, look, this cannot happen, and we will still be here, we will still protest, is the main thing that we all have to rally around at the moment.
Asad, did you want to come in?
Just maybe adding on to Zehrah's absolute important point, showing up on the streets is important. Look, you know, a week on Friday, this bill was going to go through with very, very little opposition, right? It's because of the organising on the Saturday that by Monday, both Labour had shifted its position. There'd been widespread concern about it. We're in a situation now where, you know, you've got 200 plus organizations signed the Liberty and Friends of the Earth and other letter. And what's fascinating is that you've got everybody from the RSPB on one side, Quakers, right through to movements. And the question for us, I think the big question is, you know, how do you hold this mega coalition together that has, of course, the law bar? And part of our job as progressives is to raise the law bar of what is acceptable, right? Because this is where the danger is, that they give ground on one or two pieces and then say everything else is all right. But at the same time, our as progressives is also not to try and create the high bar so that we only become a tiny coalition, right? It's how do you start at a low bar, but then politically move that bar up as the movement grows, as you politicize more and more people. And I think there's a comment in there about the trade unions, and it's great to see that the trade unions are signing on to this. Great to see that the trade unions also see that this is an absolute threat to workers and workers organizing. You know, this issue about the noise is not simply about demonstrations, right? It will be used against pickets. It will be used against workers taking action against corporations, companies, etc., etc. So we know that it's draconian in that sense. To some extent, you know, our biggest friend in this is time, right? We have to slow it down. That's, I think, our main job. It's slow it down, not allow them to be able to ram it through. And the more that we're doing and lobbying our MPs, the more we're raising questions, the more we're trying to get in, creates that dynamic to slow it down so that they can't rush it through Parliament in the way that I think that they thought that they would be able to, right? They'd have the first reading, second reading, there'd be no opposition, Labour would abstain, and it would just get through. Now we are in a moment where we have to flood it with amendments. Yes, lobby, bog it down in the committee stage, make sure that there is opposition in the Lord, but not then to simply say that's our hope, but use the time to build the movement, because we know that this bill will be passed in one way or another, and there will be egregious and draconian elements within it. And how do we then move from the resistance? How can we both resist and mobilize and then lead a counterattack against it? So I think we have to have and I'm sure, again, this is your conversation on Friday, and I'm sure I don't want to jump those discussions to there.
Thank you very much. And just on the theme of sort of like what else can we do next? Sisters Uncut just put on Twitter 2 or 3 minutes ago that they have organized a public online meeting, which is taking place tomorrow at 7 p.m. So that's after the webinar session for tomorrow. So Sisters Uncut are hosting a public meeting that everyone is welcome to. So please do attend to that if you can. We all owe so much to Sisters Uncut for really taking the lead on this. Because without them, we would not have seen the shows of strength that we've seen over the last few days and the mass mobilization against the bill that has come out since then. So we've got a few more questions. I might just ask a few at a time, and then panelists, please feel free to take whichever ones you want. So the first one that's come in is, how do we keep feminist politics central to this movement against police powers as it broadens? The second one is, thanks to all the speakers, I just wanted to ask a question. In the context of a left that is numerous but disorganized and demoralized in the wake of the defeat of Corbynism, how do we find a way of crystallizing opposition to both this bill and the wider attack on our civil liberties in a way that builds our capacity to act and opens a space for strategic discussions about the way forward? So yeah, we'll ask those two for now. And so please feel free to take on whichever one you want. Emmanuelle, do you want to go first, or should we work backwards this time? Okay, other way around. Asad, it's you first this time.
Sure. Look, you know, I think those who are in the progressive movement will always say, look at the 1980s, the left was demoralized. Look at the 1990s, the left was demoralized. We're always demoralized in one way or another, because actually what we're fighting for is such a transformation, not just of this moment, but of centuries old racialized capitalism, a system. And we shouldn't be worried that there are momentary setbacks in any moment, right? The question is always, when that setback happens, are you further from where you started? Have you politicized more people? Is there new movements spreading, being created? Are they connected together? Now, there are moments where it lends itself for our ecology of movements to be able to come together. And to some extent, the government has given us a gift with this, because it allows the ecology of our movements, from climate to traveller and gypsy communities, to the feminist movements, to anti-racist groups, to climate group, all to see, and work trade unions to see a common thing, and for us to weave and rebuild a new sort of progressive movement behind a fight. And in that fight, as I said, that's the moment where, you know, what comes out of it has got to be, you know, better organizations, not individuals, not atomized individuals, not individuals on social media, but organized people to collectively together. This was the lesson of the monitoring groups out in from the 1970s to the 80s. It's why you saw the black-led organizations from Mangrove all decide our resistance is never going to be possible if we just resist. At these moments, we need our own institutions, we need to capacity build, we need our own structures, and they need to be rooted in our community. We need to be working 24/7, 365 days a year, so that we can build our power. So when these attacks come, we're actually able to mobilize the power of our communities, and our communities aren't on the sideline, and that we as the left are fighting without our own movements and our communities behind. There has been an incredible moment, of course, with the climate strikers and Black Lives Matter. This is a moment to, I think, to solidify that and build that even further. So I'm not in a demoralized state. I'm in a very hopeful moment that actually our movements can really do something much really profound, which is, you know, build that movement of movements, which we all know is needed. I won't say about the feminist politics, because I think that's absolutely got to be central. I would say there are lessons about how we did and put race right at the center in the 1980s, and that was about Black-led organizations taking leadership. And I would say absolutely Sisters Uncut, that's great, because what that intersectional approach of bringing race, gender and class together is got to be sit at the center of all of our movement building.
Zehrah or Emmanuelle, do you want to come in? Zehrah?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just pick up from what Asad was saying about yeah, absolutely, about feminism in this movement. I mean, I think that in some ways feminism has been centered in this movement, you know, and it has been done so by the very nature of what we're talking about in terms of the particular types of state and gendered violence, but also in the groups that have been leading it. And like Asad said, you know, Sisters Uncut are a group that are predominantly led by women and non-binary people of color, and they have been on the front lines. And we at Black Protest Legal Support are so proud that we are also a group led by Black and brown women and non-binary people, and those are the people who've been on the front lines. And that is the way that it tends to be in these sorts of movements. You know, who are the people that show up, who fight, who organize, who lead? It tends to be, you know, kind of women, non-binary people really putting themselves out there for all of our liberation. But I think what was kind of missing, or has been missing in some of the narrative, not obviously all of the narrative or what's been going on the ground, but probably the mainstream media narrative, is the fact that this is an anti-racist fight. And we need to think about, you know, who are we listening to? You know, who is getting the, you know, sort of who's taking the credit for the work, who's, you know, really like the public face of what's going on. And unfortunately, in lots of ways, that is not the people who are on the front lines at the moment. And that's why we have to center anti-racism in this always, because we know when we're talking about gendered violence, we know that Black women, Black trans women, Black non-binary people are the people who are disproportionately affected. And, you know, we can't miss that from this conversation, and that is being missed in lots of kind of discourses and spaces. So, you know, and even spaces on the left. So that is why, you know, I think that is the crucial question and the crucial thing we need to focus on going forwards.
And just really quickly to add to the brilliant things that have already been said, I think in a way that the kind of two latter questions, how do we keep feminist politics, and I think racial justice politics, as Zehrah and Asad have kind of explained, is essential to this too, central to this movement against police powers as it broadens, as well as how do we find the question around how do we find a way of crystallizing opposition to the bill and open a space for strategic discussions. I think the way in which we do both of those things is to imagine beyond the carceral state for all of us, and to recognize that it is up to us to actually reimagine what safety means. What does safety mean for us as women, or for queer people, or for trans people, for Black people, for people of color? Like, what do those, how can we actually reframe what those definitions are on our terms, and that don't rely on carceral responses to violence, for example?
Okay, thank you so much to all of our panelists. So if you look in the, so all of our panelists have been sharing links to where you can find out more about their work. Asad, if you want to drop a link to War on One in the chat, that'd be great as well. But Megan from Abolitionist Futures has put in a link to a Google document, which is compiling groups to follow and resources related to #KillTheBill. So if you go on that, you'll be able to find out all the information about groups mobilizing and different resources in order to learn more. I'm just dropping a link now to give you more information about the future webinars that we have later this week. So tomorrow we have one on why hate crime can't save us. And Friday's session, as Asad has alluded to multiple times, is about building a movement to meet this moment. And that will have organizers from various different police monitoring. So we'll have someone from the Network for Police Monitoring, NetPol, an activist from Sisters Uncut, and from other social movements as well, speaking about where do we go from here and how do we move forward. So thank you all so much for joining and attending. Thank you to all of our panelists for making time very last minute to come and give us information about the bill and inspire us into thinking about how we resist moving ahead. Solidarity, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.